All right. Wonderful. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to get started. So welcome to Guided Pathways webinar number 4, and this one is on collaborating with student services professionals. And this webinar is going to be a little less nuts and bolts and a little bit more theoretical. And I hope that it's my intention that knowing a little bit more about the theory will help us better invent ways to collaborate. So the core principles of this series is to sort of just approach the 4 design pillars of guided pathways from a variety of vantage points, just so that they're all kind of clear in our heads. One of the comments on the when we were reviewing the 434 responses from faculty around, like, what did you see as the biggest block or misconception or concern, issue, or question that would really prevent faculty leadership and engagement in guided pathways? A lot of people wrote, I just don't understand what this is. I don't have succinct talking points for this. One person wrote, like, I keep hearing the word design pillars, but I'm not really sure what that means. And so the 4 design pillars, I've created a one-pager for them. And essentially it is clarify the path for students, get students onto the path, keep students on the path, and ensure students are learning on the path. And I'm just going to check in with Alyssa for 1 minute. Alyssa, when I moved over, could you see the Word document?
Yep, and I
Good.
will paste the link into the chat here in just 1 second.
Perfect. Oh my gosh, thank you so much.
Yep,
Good. I just wanted to make sure that what I was seeing was what everyone else is seeing.
yep, I saw it. Good
Okay,
job.
cool. Yes. Okay. And then there are 4 instructional approaches in the Guided Pathways model. And these are described in chapter 3 of Redesigning America's Community Colleges. And today we're going to spend some time, the slide deck will cover some of these or this point in more detail. The other key element that I want to make sure that every webinar sort of explores in further detail is this notion of equity-minded praxis. And this is language from the State Board website, equity-minded praxis. And my boss always says, why do we have to use, he and I like to banter because I like, what are they called, 10-cent words or $10 words. I like words. I was an English teacher. But he was asking, why can't it just be practice? Why praxis? And it's a good question. And for me, I really like that word praxis because of the definition from Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is reflection and action directed at the structures to be transformed. And that is a really nice way to talk about guided pathways. This is a structural reform with the idea that if you transform your structures, then mindsets and practices will change. And we'll be going over equity-mindedness in a little bit. I'm going to do I know that I use the words unpacking and deeper dive. It was the way I was trained in graduate school. So I'm just going to say we are going to unpack equity-mindedness and do a deeper dive by explaining what that means in the context of guided pathways. The 4th sort of core principle of this webinar series is a focus on programs. And again, today's webinar is going to talk more about that, because if you still keep a course-centric model, which we'll talk about, you can't really effectively engage with other institutional stakeholders in institutional reform. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I see that a couple people are posting into the chat, and so, oh, I see, it's that's perfect. So Alyssa is posting links to the 4 design pillars, the instructional approaches, and also the definition of equity-mindedness. So thank you, Alyssa. Oops, went a little too fast there. Chapter 3 in Redesigning makes 4 key moves. It outlines the academic challenges that students face. It describes how the status quo open enrollment college has attempted to address those challenges. It discusses these 4 instructional approaches that a guided pathways redesign could use to better support students and respond to the challenges more effectively. And it provides recommendations and examples for how colleges can implement this approach to instruction. And these are the 4 approaches to instruction: emphasizing skills, concepts, and habits of mind, peer-based professional development, collaborating with student services professionals, and leveraging technology wisely. So there is a summary in the book, Redesigning America's Community Colleges, and I'm not going to read it out loud because we're actually going to we're going to do it. Sorry, I don't know how to talk about this without saying we're going to unpack it and do a deeper dive into it. I will really work about trying to find better words. But for now, I want to say that today's webinar is really about instructors working closely with librarians, technologists, and student services professionals to design courses that incorporate innovative approaches to teaching and learning. And the second webinar was about faculty defining skills, concepts, and habits of mind, and this notion of a learning facilitation approach. Webinar 3 last week was on how a college can systematically support faculty in developing and improving the approach using a collaborative inquiry framework. And again, this week is about partnering with people who are not necessarily faculty to design courses. And last week I did this with the principal, and I'm going to do it here. So instructors work closely with librarians, technologists, student services to design courses to incorporate innovative approaches to teaching and learning. And I wanted to stop for a minute and acknowledge this question about how is this different from what we're already doing? How are we not, or how are we using innovative approaches to teaching and learning? Like, what's the difference in guided pathways redesign? So one of the differences is really taking a look at everything from an equity lens. And I wanted to make sure that I showed everyone. I know that many of you who have attended other webinars have already seen this vision statement, but this is a really important statement to those of us who work at the state board. Our 9-member governor-appointed state board unanimously approved this vision statement. Leading with racial equity, our colleges maximize student potential and transform lives within a culture of belonging that advances racial, social, and economic justice in service to our diverse communities. And in the context of guided pathways, this is really about how do our structures at the status quo college prevent us from doing this? And how can we use this to change? How can we use this moment of the guided pathways implementation to really reach this vision, to achieve this vision? Right now, we know which students are most negatively impacted by business as usual, by the status quo. And again, if you've attended this webinar series before, you know that I really love this language from Dr. Deborah Jenkins. She is faculty at Clark College, and she also has an equity consulting practice called Share the Flame. And she uses the term systemically non-dominant students. And if you're interested in learning more about the framework, which I went into in a little bit more detail in a previous webinar, I've included a link here. The language of research and data is historically underserved students, and I did, I spent some time with the State Board research brief, Why Focus on Equity, in the first webinar. And here again is the definition of equity mindedness from the Center of Urban Education. And essentially, it's asking us to call attention to patterns of inequity in student outcomes. It asks us to think really hard about what can I take personal and institutional responsibility for when it comes to student success, and how do I critically reassess my practices. In addition, it asks us to be race conscious and really think about the way that historically American higher education has has I'm trying to think of the right verb here, has practiced exclusionary practices, has formed itself with exclusionary practices. And now how can we use this guided pathways redesign to think about what of our practices are continuing to exclude historically underserved and systemically non-dominant students, and how can we reframe this? So when you read through chapter 3 with an equity lens, and I think this is important because of a recent presentation at the Guided Pathways kickoff by two of the grant evaluators hired by College Spark. And they talked about how the original framework of Guided Pathways does not have an equity lens. So this is one of the big challenges of Washington State, is that we are using a model, Guided Pathways, with an equity framework, with an equity lens, and that is work that we are pioneers in. That is work that makes us unique. It makes us special. And Jan Yoshiwara, when speaking to faculty about this at the New Faculty Institute, I think 2 years ago, said that a lot of other states are looking to Washington as the groundbreakers in terms of equity. So the core argument of guided pathways with an equity focus is that systemically non-dominant and historically underserved students have experienced a multitude of opportunity gaps. And I've referenced Milner's opportunity gaps in educational practice. And I'm going to be doing a session on this at the upcoming Assessment, Teaching, and Learning Conference. If you're interested in learning more about opportunity gaps in educational practice and this opportunity gap framework. But this is because of the social and historical context of exclusionary practices in education. So students come to us with what the authors call academic challenges. When we talk about the status quo in open access education, I really want to stress this quote from Asao B. and Wei, where he talks about not being interested in the exceptions. Of course, there are exceptions to the status quo. There are lots of people doing amazing and innovative things. However, there are still larger patterns that require our collective attention. And again, I just like this quote about we focus a lot on the exceptions, and then we fool ourselves into believing that because there's exceptions that it just no longer exists or it's broken by anyone with enough willpower or chutzpah. And unfortunately, that is just not true. So the big shift from the status quo to the guided pathways college, and this is very important to understand when we start thinking about how to include and partner with non-faculty stakeholders. Course-centric approach is the status quo. It has a strong focus on individual faculty who design and teach their own courses, and the driving institutional focus is student enrollment. So how do we get success is defined as how many students enroll into courses. Guided Pathways is asking us to shift over to a programmatic approach and really focus on a variety of different stakeholders from around the institution who collaborate to ensure student learning over the course of a program of study. And the driving institutional focus is on students who students completing programs. I want to stress this, and again, the reason I'm presenting this information is because I've sat with those 434 responses to the survey around faculty, what faculty questions are, what faculty barriers are, what faculty identify as the issues. And I really want to stress that in guided pathways, completing programs does not mean, oh, just give everybody a passing grade and move them along whether they're ready or not. Completing programs means that the institution begins the journey of guided pathways with the end in mind. And the end in mind is the quality and equity of student learning. There's a lovely quote by Rob Jenkins. This is in a Chronicle of Education article. Our continuing quest, both individually and as a faculty, is not so much to figure out how to teach as to figure out how to create a place where students can and will learn. And I think that's a really beautiful way to phrase it, because a lot of our status quo processes with onboarding of faculty, with onboarding, I guess I can't speak to how we onboard staff because I've never been on the student services side. I've only been on the instruction side of the house. But a lot of times the focus is on, I have to figure out how to teach. And guided pathways is really about figuring out how to create an institution where students can learn. So the end in mind, which with guided pathways begins, is that faculty define the skills, concepts, and habits of mind that students need to achieve by the end of their program of study. So for academic transfer, that means transfer to a baccalaureate or a university with junior level status in a major. And for professional technical, this means that you're ready for entry into a specific job in the workforce. And I'm going to spend this webinar to go into a little bit more detail about default program maps, because I haven't in past webinars. And I think before we can start to think about how to really partner with institutional stakeholders around student learning, some confusion around default program maps has to be addressed. So the default program maps are a particular sequence of courses that's the default for students who choose a particular program of study. So for example, I was talking to anthropology faculty last week, and she was saying that for the default for students who choose anthropology, they suggested that students take medieval literature in the program of study. Now, if the default is students take medieval literature, right? However, if the student doesn't want to take medieval literature, they could take film. It's totally fine to do that. It's just that the default is that students get a very carefully sequenced program of study. The reason is so that students have access to an educationally coherent pathway. This will provide, with the intention of providing quality and equity of learning. And the task for faculty is that the task, not just for faculty, is that the course level outcomes map up to the program level outcomes. And then the students take these courses in a particular sequence so that the program can really embody this learning facilitation model. And every course is building on skills, concepts, and habits of mind necessary for courses further along the program map. And again, our current model in the status quo does not allow for this. This is something that assessment, and last week, if you attended the webinar, I did a brief history of assessment, that in the 90s, there was a battle over assessment. Was assessment about ensuring the quality of student learning, or was assessment about measuring things? And that the measuring people won, but that there's still a lot of work, robust work done around assessment as the scholarship of teaching and learning and inquiry into student learning. So assessment is back in 2011, was asking for a really big paradigm shift. It was asking us to shift the focus from the teacher to the program. It was asking us to think about curriculum not as a random result of courses. And the authors of Redesigning talk about it as students cobbling together their own program. The students don't, a curriculum is not just a random result of courses that don't speak to one another, but really asking our institutions to think about a curriculum as a collective product. And Bob Moorbacher, in his dissertation on two-year college faculty identity, describes this as faculty as a collective noun. We often forget that, or we don't act as if faculty is a collective noun. And I just wanted to map or align this quote from assessment in 2011 to this quote from the authors of Redesigning, that faculty define the skills, concepts, and habits of mind that students need to achieve by the end of their program and map how students will build these learning outcomes across courses. And when Gerald Graff was writing this in 2011 as a faculty member in an English department in a four-year university, I don't think the world had not yet conceived of guided pathways. But I think guided pathways is a very concrete way to imagine the untapped potential of assessment and the assessment movement as scholarship of teaching and learning. So I want to stop for a moment. I know that there's things in the chat and I'm eager to see what those are. And I also invite you to think about this for a minute. So let's play the believing game. And I had slides in the second webinar on the believing game, but how might shifting the status quo focus away from individuals teaching largely in isolation at the course level and moving towards the program, to the curriculum understood as a collective product, how might this be an equity move? I know that this is a question that faculty are asking across the system. I know that this is a real question. This is not a technical exercise, but how, again, thinking about the curriculum as a collective product, how might that be an equity move? And Alyssa, I'm wondering what you have seen in the chat.
Actually, the chat's been pretty quiet, Jen. I've just been posting a lot of the links from your different slides in case anybody wanted to go and look at anything of your resources while you were talking. So
thank you.
It's pretty quiet, actually.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
Yep, no worries.
So just go ahead and if folks could, and again, I obviously I invite you to play the believing game, but if people would like to play the doubting game, that's fine too. But just what are your responses to this notion of this particular move being an equity move? So Jeanette writes, sometimes there are knowledge gaps in the sequences of courses that are not being met, and we don't necessarily have the resources to reach those students. Excellent, Jeanette, excellent point. And yes, and I guess too, like I wonder, the more I kind of sit with this model, the more I wonder, how could there not be knowledge gaps in the sequences? If, especially on the academic transfer side of the house, if there's so much, if students really are trying to kind of put together their own sequence of courses and instructors are because of demands because of labor, because of money, because of time, people do primarily design their courses as individuals. How could there not be knowledge gaps? I think it's a real question. Jeanette, thank you. Other comments or thoughts? Bridget wrote, predicated on broad agreement on program outcomes. But if you put 3 faculty in a room and ask them to discuss critical thinking, you'll get 5 different opinions. Bridget, I am so glad that you said this because I think When I hear about guided pathways reforms that don't get that first agreement on program outcomes, I wonder, like, and again, I'm just playing an intellectual game here, but I don't understand how it could be guided pathways. Like, you have to have, to me, for this model, the whole point of it is to get agreement on the learning outcomes for a program and defining program in a very interdisciplinary way. And I guess the thing I would say, and I think you would agree with me because you're a professional developer, if you put three people in a room and ask them to discuss critical thinking, you will get five different opinions. I see the joke there, three faculty, five different opinions. But if you do so with artifacts, if you do so with assignments, if you do so with student learning, there is far more agreement than there is disagreement. And we have found this in the Bridge to College program, which is in both English and in math, that there is far more agreement about what we know and what we want students to know and be able to do than there is disagreement. And later in this webinar, we'll talk about one example of literacy, assignment literacy. I'm so sorry, not assignment literacy, on information literacy was the term I was looking for there. So Brian writes, this move could allow us to better understand what barriers there are in the curriculum and how meaningful those barriers are. Wow, Brian, this is a great point. Yes, absolutely. We don't know what barriers there are right now because we don't have default maps. And if we do have default maps, we'll know better. Jeanette writes, students have sometimes met the prereqs for upper classes, but they don't have the knowledge to be successful in the next class. Absolutely. Bridget also wrote in, and never mind opinions on how to teach critical thinking. Yes, absolutely. Shanna Friend, oh, hi, Shanna. Faculty support each other in providing students with the same message regarding student goals. Yes, that constant reinforcement. Students are not going to learn complicated things in just one course. It needs to be developed and modified and reified over time. Great point. Bridget, critical thinking, we may not agree on a definition, but we know it when we see it. And I guess too, Bridget, I would just say that I think there are some really, really great resources, and I know you know these too, around, for example, the value rubrics. Those rubrics are very useful tools to think about critical thinking that go beyond we know it when we see it. Tim asks a question from Shoreline. Bridget wrote, Bridget wrote to me this privately. Thank you for indulging me. Bridget, I think that it's really important for you to say these things. I'm glad you are because, yeah, it's not indulging you. It's really important that we all air all of our thoughts and beliefs about this, or we will never move forward in a way that brings everyone along. I think it's really important, so I'm grateful to you. Tim says, a question from Shoreline. When you talk about program, what is defined as a program? I suspect we all might have a different idea of what this is. Oh my gosh, Tim, thank you for this question. Let's go, I wanna go back for a minute because this is a big deal. Okay, so what is a program? So for example, transfer to a baccalaureate or university with junior level status in a major. So psychology would be a program in this model. And actually, I'm just thinking if I can get over to my let me just see what I can do here. I just want to show you something that I think will be useful. So this hanging down thing makes it difficult for me to do what I want to do, but I think I've got it there. So just really quickly, can you see my screen that is the book Redesigning America's Community Colleges?
Yep, we've got it, Jen, thanks.
Okay, cool. So designing program maps and defining program. So the four most popular disciplines that they used at Miami-Dade were business, psychology, biology, and criminal justice. And obviously this is on the academic transfer side. So again, a program is a program is defined by whatever the end in mind is. So, and again, I think it does make sense, as Miami-Dade did, to look and see what are what are the most popular goals for students, like when they come in. And there's also a tool that was introduced at the Student Success Institute at in the fall, and I can send that out. But basically, it's a tool created by the Community College Research Center that allows every one of our 34 colleges to see what are students enrolling in. So you can actually see how students are moving through your programs. So you can decide like what are the things that most students want to do, and then use those as your kind of like if you were going to start with maybe your first four. Tim, I'm going to stop talking for a minute and just ask if that is useful information. Tim said, yep, but I don't know if you can, I don't know if you mean yes, you can see my screen, or yes, that answered the question. While we're waiting, oh, Tim says, give me a sec. Okay, so Wendy asked, I think, a related question. Did they choose those programs because they had actual degrees with those names? So Wendy, I don't know the answer to that question about Miami-Dade, but I will say that I think that it's really important for a college to think about where are the actual literal places that a student might end up. Like, for example, an English major. What does junior level status look like for English, biology, chemistry, anthropology? And I think right now, because I talked to somebody from Spokane Falls just a few days ago, I think Spokane Falls used a really great model for this. And so I would, I've already, I already have plans to reach out to Heather Keast at Spokane to ask how she organized this. She's a faculty member who helped with this. So, but yes, they chose the way you want to define a program is based on the end goal of the student in terms of either transfer to status as to a degree or a goal. So I guess I'm trying to decide if I should answer Brian's question first or Tim's question first. So Brian, I think I'm going to go with yours just first off. So my question about transfer programs in particular, how do we differentiate between the recommended and required default courses, i.e. the psych major must take 3 specific psych courses, but they could opt out of a recommended public speaking course for humanities distribution? Let me just wrap my mind around this sentence. How do we differentiate between recommended and required default courses? Okay, I get it. So Brian, this is a really interesting question. And I think in the guided pathways, like kind of like straight up model, there is nothing recommended. Everything in the default is required. So, and one of the early days mantras was students don't do optional. That if you say, if you say like, oh, you could do this, this, or this, or you could do this, but it's optional, students won't do it. So the idea is that if something is good for students, if it's really important for students, you don't make it optional, you make it mandatory. In terms of what I learned about the way that Spokane Falls is mapping is they gave people options. There were certain things that were required, and then there were other things that could be opted out. And how they determined what the, or sorry, not opted out. Okay, sorry, I'm a little bit over my head here, so I'm just going to back up and go back and say, in the traditional model, the default is indeed a default. So if you have like, 2 years worth of courses, the student just gets it. I know at Spokane Falls, they're building in some narrower amount of choice into their program map, but I don't know enough about it to say that. And so I think maybe these are things when I ask them if they'll present on this at the ATL conference that I can build in. So Brian, thanks for this question. And Brian, I will also continue to ponder this question, and if I have a more coherent answer, I will send it to you. And Tim said, I wonder if the question we asked, if we're concerned about a discipline program narrow versus a campus curriculum program broad. Many faculty would say they are already thinking about program success, not considering the other parts that need to fit and support student success. So Tim, I think with this particular question about discipline program being narrow, I think the way that the authors describe it in the early parts of the text is that right now, when we conceive of preparing students for a program, what do we mean? So for example, in an English department, like I might talk about my program, but it's very insular. Like it's very much like I talk to other English faculty about the program. I don't talk to other faculty outside of English about, oh, so when students in the English major take interpersonal communication, and again, I'm making that particular example up about interpersonal communication. Oh, I've got a better one. In the English department, in terms of the philosophy courses, is there a particular philosophy course where students could get exposure to continental philosophy? Because continental philosophy and critical theory, as it's manifested in the English department, has a very close tie-in. So again, like it's asking, it's looking at major readiness, not just from the perspective of your own discipline, but really thinking about what are the other pieces that a student might need, but that come from other disciplines. Another example I got from a faculty member at Whatcom was in chemistry, students doing better after they had taken a certain art course because that art course embedded and inculcated certain concepts, skills, and habits of mind that made it easier for the students to succeed in later chemistry courses. So I think, again, this is why you want to get your faculty together as a collective and thinking about what is the end in mind in terms of major readiness, and then what would be the ideal sequence of courses from other disciplines that students could take. I'm going to stop for a moment and just ask, is this making sense? Okay, Robert says yes, I'm so glad. And Brian wrote, okay, Brian wrote this to me privately, and I'm actually hoping that, Brian, I'm hoping that this is not a huge, I'm hoping that I might be able to actually, okay, he said, sure, great, thank you. Okay, my big rhetorical question. Does guided pathways mean the general AA disappears? That there are only specific MRPs with the potential to explore under a larger meta major for a quarter or two? So I can't answer this question. I can say that the Jennifer Wetham response is eventually, yes, the general AA would disappear, but I'm not actually sure what someone like Davis Jenkins would say. I will say that the general AA, I've been getting a lot of questions about how is the AA and the program distribution requirements, how is that not a meta major? And my answer is that it's still too broad, it's still too general. It doesn't ensure major readiness in the way that this is asking for, because it still gives students so much choice that the students are still going to have to cobble together their own the students are still going to have to cobble together their own program, as opposed to the faculty really thinking about what do we want this program to look like? What courses do we want students to take? What are we noticing in terms of where students are not getting what they need? And so we want to make sure that we're aligning what we're doing with other faculty members. I think math is another one. English, obviously, writing is another one. And so I think, yes, at the end of the day, the general AA would disappear, and there would only be specific programs that have very specific meta majors. That have very specific program maps, and then and the authors of Redesigning talk about this, that there would be an exploratory pathway, or there would be room to explore within the meta major. And again, the book goes into this in a little bit more detail. And meanwhile, I will ask Davis Jenkins and Christy Wellington Baker what their responses to this question would be. So thank you. Tim wrote, we came up with more questions. How would programs transfer? And would it affect their ability to get into a highly selective program? Okay, this is a great question. And this is, I think, one of the working areas of guided pathways. In other systems, there are more cohesive relationships with 4 years, and right now the AA degree is our relationship with our 4-year transfer partners. And again, I know that I've used the Maricopa model before, but Maricopa had in Arizona, Maricopa Community College had a similar relationship with Arizona State University, where students they had automatic entry into the university, but not to a program, not like, so for example, I'll just use the example of the English major again. So if I'm an English major and I follow the AA degree, and I fill out all the boxes on the associate's degree, I don't necessarily have entry into junior level status at University of Washington. I just have entry into the institution, but not to the major. And so one of the questions that Bridget Nolte asked, and I think the state board is exploring this option, is that this really requires working with 4-year colleges to say what would be the right sequence of courses that students would take so that they get junior level status into the major. And I guess right now, like when I think about how would programs transfer, if you're using Common Course numbered courses to create your program maps, it would still transfer the same. It would still transfer in the same way. So for example, like let's just say that I would take like English 101, I'd take Math 146, maybe. I'd take Psych 101. It's just stipulating when students take those courses and in what order, so that the instructors can work together to sequence the learning of that student rather than just leaving it up to the student. So I guess I feel like programs would transfer in the sense that the way that the normal AA degree transfers, and yet there's still a lot of unexplored work that could be very useful and beneficial to be done there. And how would it affect their ability to get into highly selective programs? And I think what you mean is like, well, maybe what you mean is, could a student transfer to Harvard? Could a student transfer to, maybe is the highly selective programs a professional technical question, or is it a academic transfer question? Because my undergraduate experience at a relatively prestigious 4-year university was architected choice with a default program map. So I had very little choice in, I went to a private college, and the way that they justified a $30,000 tuition a year was, we will guarantee that the majority of our students graduate in 4 years. And so I had very little choice. So I went to basically a Catholic guided pathways model. And so again, like I don't know if I don't see how this would compromise rigor in any way. I think the intention is to deepen and intensify learning so that they would be more eligible to get into a highly selective program. But maybe I'm not understanding the question. So Tim says kind of both for students transferring in a discipline, STEM or nursing, as well as more privileged institutions. And I guess maybe I would just kind of go back to that question and ask, what are the assumptions this question is making about guided pathways? Because for me, the way that I understand guided pathways is that the reason you create these default program maps with the end in mind is so that students are more prepared to get into highly selective programs. And that the only thing this would change is that more students would actually complete the program and transfer because the quality of their learning would benefit from this curricularly coherent model, as opposed to the curricular incoherence that a lot of our students suffer, not because people aren't doing a great job teaching well in their own classrooms, but because of that mixed message curriculum that Gerald Graff talks about that I've mentioned in other webinars. And for nursing, I think nursing programs, as I understand them right now, already use a guided pathways model in this sense that there's very limited choice and that that there's very limited choice and that there's already a lot of alignment across the program and that courses are approached as kind of a stepping stone. I could be wrong about this. And I think for nursing, the question would be more about what are the equity gaps in terms of who is completing these programs and who isn't, and how do we change our teaching to make sure that we're closing equity gaps. Anne Levine wrote, how does ESL fit into this, particularly at the beginning levels? And this is a really important question, and this is outside of my current expertise at this time. And I know that William Durden and our basic education for adults programs are doing they're offering a lot of professional development specifically around ESL and ABE faculty being integral to guided pathways. And so what I will do is when I send out the recording for the webinar, I'll also send you how to see what those trainings are, because I know they're doing very specific trainings on ESL and adult basic education. But my short answer is that ESL faculty and ABE faculty must be included in guided pathways designs, because these are the students we really want to move forward in pathways. And I've actually, I've asked Will Durden to do a presentation at the ATL conference, because right now, most schools still have kind of 2 dev ed pathways that go up to college level that are more than one course. And this is really not a good practice. This is very inequitable. And so Will is going to do a presentation on what are the best practices around collapsing your dev ed sequence so that ESL and adult basic education students have the best chance to get into college level coursework as quickly as possible. Bridget wrote, many Prof Tech programs are pretty prescriptive and guided, including the most post-baccalaureate professional degrees. Absolutely. And Tim wrote thanks, and Anne wrote thanks, and I'm just going to say thank you, because I really appreciate these questions. And I also appreciate your graciousness with me as I kind of fumble around with my answers, because I have thoughts about this, but it's really nice to have this opportunity to share them and then learn as I go. So I am going to go back to challenges in change, technical problems and adaptive challenges. And I hope that you'll indulge me in this, because I think that this is really good leadership theory around the why of guided pathways. So I want to go over, sorry, let me go back to present. So a lot of you may already be familiar with this notion of technical problems and adaptive challenges, and that technical problems can be solved with the knowledge of experts, and that adaptive challenges require new learning. And unfortunately, most of our challenges right now are adaptive. Alyssa, is there a question? Oh, um, sorry, I thought that was Alyssa. Okay.
I
Um,
don't think so, Jen. I think we're good.
oh, okay, cool, cool. I think maybe somebody unmuted themselves. Okay, so the characteristics of a technical problem. A technical problem is clearly defined and often persists and is recurrent. And there's usually a best practice solution. And so fixing a technical problem is basically you decide it, you learn about it, you implement it, you execute it. And the example that we used in last week's webinar is the students aren't reading, which is clearly defined and often persistent. And so a best practice solution exists, which is reading apprenticeship. And so basically, you know, an individual faculty member or a group of faculty might decide, we're going to get trained on reading apprenticeship, and you learn the strategies and then you start implementing and executing them. The characteristics of an adaptive challenge are different. They call them adaptive because they literally adapt and they're fluid and they change with the circumstances, which makes them sometimes even more frustrating. An adaptive challenge could be a new challenge, it could be unique. More often it's unclear or ill-defined. And I know that in our English 101 group, as we have been focusing on equity gaps and how do we work together to close equity gaps at the English 101 level, that people have a lot of different opinions about what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So ill-defined can just mean that people might question if it's really a problem at all. People might say, well, yes, that is a problem, but these are like, there's a dissent over what is causing the problem. So then sometimes there's no known solution, and sometimes there's too many solutions with no clear choice. And what I think is really moving and exciting about adaptive challenges and this framework is that the solution is found in the collective intelligence of employees at all levels. And the organization learns its way towards solutions. One example of an adaptive challenge is placement reform. So placement reform in English and math literally adapts itself. So you make one change and then everything changes. And it's a fluid thing. And it does indeed change with circumstances because every college's student population is so different. And the size, the geography, so the challenge is adaptive in that sense. And there are solutions, but there's so many solutions that sometimes it's hard for a department to make a choice. And it's not the kind of thing that you can just put one faculty member to work on and be like, done, because you need people in your assessment and testing center to work with you. You need your institutional researchers to work with you. You need your diversity and equity chief officer to be working with you. There's so many different stakeholders in terms of placement assessment that and again, your organization really does have to learn its way towards solutions. And Whatcom, for example, has made a lot of really great moves. And every time it makes a change, the organization learns something about placement assessment that changes its practice. So again, it's complicated stuff. And I wanted to give us a metaphor to consider around the solution to adaptive challenges being found in collective intelligence of employees at all levels. And I went to a training a few weeks ago on deep democracy and what's known as co-resolve. And I wish that I had a picture of the whiteboard and I didn't have time to draw one, but I want you to think about all that bulk of the iceberg that's below the surface. That is all the good stuff. That is all the things, that's all the wisdom of our institutions that hardly ever gets tapped into because of the way our organizations are structured, because of the way that our labor, the way that we have this core-centric model that we've been discussing. It's very difficult to make changes, and it's very difficult to access that huge collective wisdom that can happen when you have a lot of different people from around the institution putting their minds to work on solving the problem. And I will just take a moment to give major kudos to Shannon Waits from Highline and Marcy Sims from Green River, because a couple years ago, I asked them if they would lead a year-long professional development experience around placement assessment for cross-functional teams. And this was really the motivation behind it. The project was called Placement 360. And this was really what I was hoping Shannon and Marcy would be able to do. And I know that they really did it. They really created events and structures so that institutions could really get to that bulk of the iceberg. Because a lot of times, you know, like when you get people into the room, you stay at this kind of iceberg level because people remain in their silos, or the structures of the institution kind of shut us down. And I think this is really the major potential of guided pathways, is using whatever happens with your guided pathways redesign to get at the good stuff that's below the surface when you are really trying to think the purpose of every meeting is to get to that collective intelligence that right now our status quo system is not accessing, or makes it very difficult to access. So given that we're spending a little bit more time going over the questions, which I really appreciate, I'm wondering if people would indulge me and just think about for a minute, can you identify an adaptive challenge from your vantage point right now? So an adaptive challenge, it's fluid, it's new, unique, unclear, ill-defined, no known solution, or too many solutions with no clear choice. Can you think of an adaptive challenge from your vantage point? And go ahead and type that into the chat. Bridget wrote parenting.
I totally laughed when I read that. Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a good one.
Are there specific adaptive challenges to parenting? I don't have kids, but I think if I were a parent, cell phone use would be a really big adaptive challenge for me. Oh, Brian wrote, yes, Bridget, I would add starting the concept of an allowance. Bridget, handling a tantrum. Oh, Bridget, that is a brilliant one. Jeanette, talking to children about death or any hard topic. Whew, that's a great one. This is awesome. Yes, exactly. Potty training. Wendy wrote teen to adult transition. Oh my gosh, yes. Yes, I feel like I'm still making that transition myself. So if anyone wants to adaptively parent me, I would be really grateful. Table manners. Yes. What else? These are great. These are great. So this is wonderful. Oh, okay. Yeah, Shayna, ABE to credit transition best practices. Whew, that's a perfect one. Yes. Oh my gosh, perfect example. Brian, requiring or recommending a student success course for all students. That is a big adaptive challenge for a lot of different reasons. New college administration. Yes, yes. I think like parenting, the new college administration one is another one that we don't have to do it here, but unpacking like all the different challenges of having a new college administration is there's a lot of different subcategories that go with that, like yeah, that's a big one. I would also say assessment plans are adaptive challenges, because you can't just take one college's assessment plan and be like, okay, this will work for us. Like it's very difficult. Course to program level outcomes assessment. Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Bob. That's a great one. Good. Okay, so now we're kind of warmed up. Oh, we were just talking about table manners in our club. One of our business faculty brought up teaching Western European table manners to folks going into business while finding ways to decenter that. Oh my gosh, that's great. And thank you too, because I think that's another really great example of an equity lens. Like if there are certain business conventions that are Eurocentric, how do you make sure that your students get the skills that they need to be successful and yet also not privilege not privilege it over other table manners? Jeanette, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so with that, moving in a slightly different direction with adaptive challenges, I got faculty and instructional leaders from there's 12 early adopter colleges, and I think I asked 8 people total to just talk to me a little bit about, what are your challenges to faculty leadership and engagement? And I think another way to look at this is that there are certain technical problems that are just easier to solve. And so it's very easy to make a guided pathways plan that only does the technical problems and then never really gets to the real work, which are in these adaptive challenges. So they came up with a really great presentation. It's called Past the Pep Rally, like that the first couple of years of their guided pathways implementation was really more of a pep rally. And that the second space of faculty engagement is when you move beyond this notion of like, okay, let's get together and talk about X, Y, or Z. But when you're actually trying to do this cross-functional work that really does bust into other people's silos, where it stops being just somebody's good idea and starts becoming somebody's job responsibility, then that's the second space of faculty engagement. And I'll include the links to the slide deck and the handout. But in the context of this particular webinar, I wanted to talk about one adaptive challenge that was identified, which is that silos remain a thing. So ideally, your guided pathways redesign is to restructure your university or your college to break down silos. Silos between departments, silos between divisions, silos between your writing center and classrooms, silos between your assessment program and your and the real work of faculty, silos. Like there's so many silos. I'm sure we could have a blast brainstorming silos the way that we just did with adaptive challenges to parenting. But here are 2 very specific examples, and these are from faculty leaders at early adopter colleges here in Washington. So one person said, guided pathways asks faculty to think in different ways about teaching and learning. We don't want to miss opportunities for faculty to see their role in the context of, say, working with student services. And there is an assumption that faculty don't need to be part of the advising redesign because that's the advisor's job. Faculty have perspectives, educating around the work that they do and how advising to do the work. Sorry, it looks like my transcribing missed something there, but how to do the work effectively, especially with an equity lens. And I know that in the faculty survey, in those 434 responses, there was definitely a theme around, I don't see what my role is, because if this is just about advising, then what role would I play? And so again, like I thought it was interesting that 2 of the faculty leaders that were part of this larger ongoing conversation both brought up this idea of it's really asking faculty and student services, or it's really asking all of us to think very seriously about this learning facilitation model. And that's why in the book, they actually break it out. They're like, faculty do this, faculty define the learning outcomes, faculty create the program maps, and the college takes on this learning facilitation model, which means that if you're really doing learning facilitation, every place a student is encountering, like that's why it's the four design pillars, like faculty, sorry, I'm not saying this articulately. I'm going to stop for a moment, take a deep breath. And just say that teaching and learning happens inside and outside of the classroom. And the cafeteria model hasn't set us up to capture those opportunities very well. And there's a beautiful quote here from these faculty: students live in between the silos. And I really wish I had put that on its own slide. Students live in between the silos. And I don't remember which faculty member said this, but the faculty's superpower is to say the unsayable. Can be really uncomfortable, but also very revealing. And specifically, faculty have, I want to make sure that I really contextualize this. And also this quote about the faculty's superpower comes from one of our Assessment Matters podcast episodes. And before I get to that, I want to say that a lot of people who work on the student services side have very different contracts. The faculty contract means that a lot of faculty are tenured. Not a lot, I'm sorry. The full-time faculty are tenured, which is not a lot of our faculty. But for tenured faculty who do have tenure, they can say things that people on the student services side might not be able to say because of the difference of their contracts. And I know that the spirit in which this quote was offered is that faculty can help support some changes that must be made that aren't being made right now because it would put people in vulnerable positions. And this is particularly true when it comes to the work of equity and challenging the dominant structures. So again, if you're interested in learning more about this, the Assessment Matters podcast link is here. Anne Brackett and Christine Washburn talk about this very eloquently. And for transformative change, this is taken from one of their ATL presentations a few years ago. You want to be really cautious of focusing on guided pathways as faculty-led. And because of my very strong language around faculty engagement and faculty leadership, I've been called on this a couple times. This really has to be a cross-campus collaboration, and that faculty engagement is within that context. So it isn't just faculty, hunkering down with themselves, creating meta majors and program maps. It's really thinking about all aspects of the institution. And again, just going back to that metaphor of the iceberg, really tapping into the collective wisdom of the group that we currently have not really been able to tap into in sustained ways because of the way the status quo institution is structured around courses and course enrollment. So when it comes to incorporating innovative approaches to teaching and learning, in the course-centric model, faculty innovate or don't at the course level, and they do it often it's in isolation. Like, there might be a movement around learning communities, but it's very difficult to sustain in our current model because of the course-centric focus. But with a programmatic approach, faculty innovate with other faculty in a program, and the default program map, the default course map for that program is a structure around which people innovate. And then other stakeholders can come alongside to aid that innovation in a way that right now the status quo model doesn't let us. And there's a very specific example coming. If I could redo this slide deck, I'd put it there. But first, the untapped potential in the status quo is that every institution employs this huge range of professional staff whose positions are not strictly instructional, but who do work with students and have a rich trove of information about how students think, what they care about, and how to help them learn. And there's a list here from the authors of Redesigning. One that they did not put in, and I'm sure they would have, is officers of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and any other staff positions that specifically focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think a common complaint that I hear, and I'm going to state it very boldly, is that an institution will hire an officer of diversity, equity, and inclusion and be like, okay, good, you take care of that. And again, Guided Pathways offers us a lot of potential to really leverage the people who hold those positions to really share what they know and are able to do, and to share that expertise with all of us. So again, I think the way that oftentimes these positions can be siloed is very telling. It's how could our structures really utilize those positions better, and the people who hold them. Teaching and learning center staff, I think, are another way, like, they oftentimes get pushed to the margins, and we talked about that a little bit last time. Writing center staff, and of course librarians, and that's going to be the specific example coming up. So the quote is, regardless of whether they are formally classified as staff or faculty, like at some schools, librarians have faculty roles, or they're formally classified as faculty, same with counselors. In most colleges, these professionals' expertise remains isolated and rarely informs instructional practice. Yeah, if I could redo this slide deck, I'd do this a little bit differently. Examples that are particularly relevant to Guided Pathways. One example that they give is that the final stages of course mapping include student services professionals. And there is a model from Miami-Dade in Redesigning that I think is useful to look at. But also the integration of librarians and other student supports professionals into the course design process is another really important one. So information literacy is the example that they give in Redesigning, and that almost every department or almost every discipline speaks to the importance of information literacy as being really important to success in terms of not just transfer to a major, to coursework at the 300 and 400 level, but also to workforce, also to, like, if I'm going into a job. And also, it's one of those other really important skills that isn't just transferable to a job, but also is really transferable to creating citizens of a democracy. If you don't have a high competency in terms of competencies in terms of information literacy, how does that affect how you vote? How does that affect how you engage civically? Another more practical example, how do you buy a car? How do you choose a credit card? Information literacy is just one of those really far-reaching things. And it's oftentimes in the domain of the library. And there are certain courses like English 102, the research paper class, that does deal almost exclusively with information literacy. But the current course-centric model makes library instruction really hard. And I know that my librarians out there, I was on a librarian's tenure committee when I was faculty at Green River. Library instruction is really difficult because of the way we set up this course-centric model. So I might say, okay, we're going to have a library session. Everybody's going to meet in the library and we're all going to have this presentation. It's oftentimes very short term. And in the book, they lay out very eloquently why information literacy and partnering with librarians is really difficult. However, one of the potentials of a course map, if you know the sequence of courses that a student is going to take in the order they're going to take them, and you have faculty working in these interdisciplinary teams thinking about the program and thinking about when students are going to take a class, you can start to embed at systematic points, okay, this is the course that's really going to focus on the kind of like introduction to information literacy. And then a couple courses later, this course is going to give students that next level. And then this course is the one that's going to give them the capstone experience that gives them that next level of, or allows them to show the skills they've built over the program. So information literacy is one example of how taking this learning facilitation approach and a focus on completing programs and using default program maps as a way to better structure a student's experience so that we know they're getting the learning that they need. And now I want to go back to the other place. So design principle number 3 is keep students on the path. And I think my best talking point for this one is that an institution offers student instructional and non-instructional supports that are all designed around these 3 really important predictors of success: academic confidence, sense of belonging, and sense of gaining employer valued skills. And another partner in this work are writing centers. Writing centers are really primed to take up instructional supports that cultivate these 3 important predictors of success. And if you have faculty working along a meta major, really thinking about where are students needing more support with their writing instruction, this is a great way to really better partner with a writing center to help students bolster academic confidence, sense of belonging, sense of gaining employer valued skills. So it really, this model has a lot of potential to help people come alongside the more traditional focus on courses. So I am going to stop and see what's happening in the chat. And Bridget wrote, I love that quote. Bridget, I want to know what quote you love. And I think it's the one about students living in the silos. And Jeanette wrote, don't forget your academic division administrative assistants. Oh my gosh, yes. And program assistance managers. Whew, Jeanette, I have chills. Yes, I will change the slide deck to add that. So true. Academic division administrative assistants see, hear, observe so much. Really important point. What else are people? Yeah, Jeanette, we work hard to build a sense of belonging. Yes, absolutely. Jeanette, thank you so much for that. That I will definitely go back and change this slide deck. You're absolutely correct. Talk about the bulk of the iceberg underneath the water. That's a big one. What else are people thinking about? What other questions are coming up or comments? Again, I love it when we play the believing game, but we can totally play the doubting game too. It would be so fun for me to just see one aha or emotional button or question that people are thinking about after this And I know that we started at 3 and it has been, it's 4:21. So I will say if there are no other comments or questions or thoughts, I will let this draw to a close. And thank you so much for joining us today. Um, I really appreciate all of the chat. I really appreciate all of the questions. This webinar series has been one of the hardest things I've ever done professionally. Just there's so much information, trying to process it, trying to like figure out what's the right way to present it. Um, I, I really appreciate people's questions because it helps me stay close to the work as it's happening on the ground. And again, too, I will take all of these questions. I'm going to highlight them all right now. And I will forward them to Davis Jenkins and to Christy Wellington Baker, just to see what their perceptions are, their responses are. And yeah, thank you. All right, well, have a beautiful afternoon, everybody. And Bridget, I think you rock too. And so does Alyssa. And let's see, yeah.
So do you, Jen. I'm going to go ahead and stop your recording, okay?
All right, thank you.